the protocol of reconciliation and grace through separation. In other words, the denomination would separate, but we would do it gracefully. That those who are of a more conservative bent, who cannot accept same-sex weddings being performed by the clergy or LGBTQ clergy, that they decided, rather than keep fighting this, and it will never resolve, decided to pull out of the United Methodist Church and create their own denomination. Well, they were going to do that in 2020 for our next scheduled general conference. It never happened because of COVID. They postponed it to this year, and because it's an international gathering, the attendees could not get visas for those outside the country. So long story short, it's been put off until 2024. The New Methodist denomination decided that's too long. We're going to go ahead and start now. So they launched May 1st, this past Sunday. It's called the Global Methodist Church. And they're not encouraging churches to join it until 2024, but some already have and are, and that's the reality. Bottom line, we will remain in the United Methodist Church, Mount Olivet. That means that there's no financial implications of that. For those churches leaving the United Methodist Church to join the Global Methodist Church, they can leave with their property, but they do need to pay whatever liabilities they have with the annual conference, which is the larger body. And most of that is clergy pension liabilities, and they calculate what that is. So bottom line, there is little to no impact that the division of the United Methodist Church will have on Mount Olivet of a financial nature or the parking lot project. Are there any questions about that? All right, I think Ryan, you were going to go next.
Thank you all. Nice to see some familiar faces this evening. I'm Ryan Brown, one of the church members. My wife Jen and our 4 kids have been going here for 15 years. Well, actually the kids haven't, because they didn't exist 15 years ago when we joined. I think Pastor had baptized at least 3 of them. So we've been longtime members and hope to be for many more decades. It's been really fun to be on this parking lot planning commission or group, I should say. I remember having lunch with Hank Hume about 13 or 14 years ago, because I had a bunch of questions and ideas as a new member at Maryland. Tranum said, "Oh, I'm going to send Hank Hume out to lunch with you and answer some of these questions." And one of the things that came up at that lunch was Hank said, "You know, we really should do something with that parking lot. We've had it since 1950 something, and it's such a great piece of land. And there's so many amazing things the church could do to further its mission and its impact on the community by developing that land." And he had a whole idea for that. So this concept of building out the parking lot and doing something with it has been around for a long time, and we've just helped push this forward to see what's possible. So in my day job as a lawyer, you get to do all these different analysis of what's legally possible and what's financially possible. And so we've been very happy to be working with Michael Foster, who will speak next, who is an amazing architect and knows the landscape of the community, what's feasible under a zoning standpoint, what's economically viable. And we went through lots of different permutations as a committee to see what could we build on the land, how big could it be at the maximum end, and maybe that's more than we actually want to build, and what kind of uses would be complementary to the church use. And so part of this is, of course, building something that is part of the church's mission, space for the church to have additional youth activities and classrooms and mission trip hosts and other things like that you can do with the space. There's so many possibilities for that we're still exploring. And then in addition to that, other things that were complementary to or extensions of the church's existing missions. So daycare is a huge issue in Arlington. We've got an amazing preschool here. A lot of parents, like my wife and I, working full-time, needed full-time daycare, something in the morning till 6 in the evening, and as much as the preschool would have been great, we couldn't send our kids here because it didn't have enough hours of coverage. So having an expanded daycare program would be very useful to church members and the community at large. And the other thing we've all seen a huge need for in the community is affordable housing and also assisted living. And we've looked at potentially doing a combination of both of those, affordable assisted living. I was telling, I think Marilyn earlier before we started, I've had several clients that after living in Arlington for 40 or 50 years, got to the point where they couldn't stay in their own home. They needed a level of care. And they just couldn't afford to stay in Arlington with the resources they had. Even after selling their home and paying off mortgages and so forth, they just didn't have enough resources to stay in Arlington, and then they're looking at assisted living in Fairfax County or somewhere further away, and they lose a lot of their community network and support structure and friends and so forth. So having additional options for senior or affordable assisted living community or independent living, again, lots of different ways that could play out, could be a big impact not only on our congregation members, but as the community as a whole. And then, of course, the other thing is parking. We have a big parking lot out there, and we need something that will allow the church members to park when we are here in large numbers on Sundays, on Wednesday nights when we have church choir and dinners and activities and so forth. And so finding another use that also was economic, but that would free up the parking at those hours when the church was using was very important. And we looked at medical office as an option for that, because it's something that's, again, a big need in the community, part of the Methodist history of healing ministries. We're close to the hospital, there's a demand for doctors' offices, and they would not need those parking spaces when the church is here. So as a committee, we're looking at all these different things. What's feasible legally, what meets the church's mission, and what would be economic, and trying to come up with something that's a balance of these different factors. And I'll turn it over here to Michael Foster to talk a little bit more about where we are in that process and what might come next. The goal is to, at the May 21st charge conference, have an approval for the church to move forward with this if that's the desire of the congregation. And so we're working with the district superintendent on the appropriate language for a motion to allow us to move the process forward so that we can continue to engage in discussions in the church and with other players in the community as to what this might turn out to look like. So we're very excited and really appreciate you all being here to bring your questions and thoughts and ideas as we work on this great project together. But I'm going to turn it over to Michael Foster of MTFA Architects to continue talking. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Pastor Ed. And I just want to say to all of you that came tonight, you chose wisely to come to the second town hall meeting, because on the first one, you might not have gotten a seat so easily. So it sounds like to me, since the first town hall meeting, there have been a lot of conversations, discussion, and understanding, so that it was nice to come in and there wasn't a large crowd with pitchforks. So that was an added bonus. But at any rate, no, seriously, I've really enjoyed working with this group because we do a lot of land use planning, a lot of work with associations, churches, clubs, as well as private developers. And a lot of times when a church starts looking at what do they do with their property, it might be because their heyday was in the post-World War II era as a church, and their congregation has fled. Well, I can tell you, this congregation is healthy, vibrant, well-heeled, and doing a lot of good things. So this project is not a last-ditch effort to save a church. It is a conscious effort to be a good steward of the gifts the Lord has given, a good steward of the land, and a good steward of the resources, those proverbial buried talents, if you will. And so when we looked at the site, there's a lot of discussion of the arts, youth, other ministries to engage a broader cross-section of the community. But it was also not, even though it's a healthy church, not a huge appetite for a massive capital campaign to build an expensive shrine to the church, which I think is good stewardship. But when we started looking at the history of the United Methodist Church and reconciling that with the zoning potential. And under S3A and SD on a busy V Road, literally walking distance from Ballston and the new development on Lee Highway, now called Langston Boulevard, that there is zoning potential to do more than the R6 single-family houses. And frankly, there's so much asphalt on that site, whatever you do would be actually kinder and gentler to the environmental stewardship and water management, just in case there's any civil engineers in the room that would be interested. But so what we did, we reconciled the zoning potential under the general land use plan, not a radical change in county vision, but a county vision under that zoning or land use plan that dates back at least 30 years or more. And I knew Frank Hume from the county 20-some years ago, and I did not know he went to church here, but he did pull me aside and said, "Oh, Mike, I'm a member of this church in Arlington, and we have this parking lot. What do you think about?" And I just knew Frank Hume from the county. I did not know which church, and he did not volunteer it. But I remember the conversation at least 20 years ago. So when you reconcile the zoning potential and the history of ministries that have a precedent in the United Methodist Church, did you know the United Methodist Church has been instrumental in housing affordability and for elder care for generations, in healing as a ministry, which translates that to health care, spiritual and physical healing, child care, education, recreation, and the arts. So therefore, your own history started to write the program, because when we started looking at those elements of childcare, healing, medical offices, housing for the elderly, and affordability, these are huge needs in our community and result in significant incentive dollars, both from federal, state, and local governments, because money isn't always the problem in a place like Arlington. Land is the problem. And not everybody wants to choose to use their land for the kind of stewardship reasons that happen to fit into your ministry heritage. We're not just making up new ideas. This is your history that's reconciled and recognized with needs in this community and a general land use plan that could accommodate them. So when we looked at that, as Ryan had alluded to, how do we balance the needs? Because if you want everything to be free, somebody's got to pay for it, which would involve a big capital campaign. So finding that balance of what percentage of the land could be used for church programming, recreation, maybe a gym, maybe something that would also convert to theatrical arts, music venue. Actually, I've had several people call. I thought after the first town hall meeting that I'd get all kinds of calls from developers and affordable housing people, which I did, but it was only about 3 or 4 of them. So that was 3 or 4 calls. I bet I've gotten a half a dozen calls from arts groups saying, "I hear you're doing a theater. We need a theater." What's on the list? We have a long way to go before we open a theater. But the point is, there's a need, and it's a ministry. And that's what's really amazing about this project. So with that, not to get too nerdy in the details, your underlying zoning is R6 for residential. So you will need to go in for a zoning change, which is very common in Arlington. That happens 20 times a year on major projects, and more on smaller ones. And with that, the key is your underlying land use designation is S3A and SD, which is public use and special development. And literally verbatim in the code, under special development, includes medical health care. It includes housing and a particular emphasis of bonus density for the elderly. And as a church, churches can go on property by right as long as you meet the building code. And most churches have a daycare component, an office component, recreation, and ancillary ministries. So I'm not going to say it's a rubber stamp, because nothing in Arlington is rubber stamp. I'm just sorry, it's just not. And matter of fact, 99% of applications start with the reasons you can't do it, but 99% do get approved. So it is a process, and it is a process of give and take, and it's a process of community engagement. And the good news is, one of the top values and priorities, when we ranked priorities of the committee and congregation, was to be a good neighbor. What does that mean, to love your neighbor? It's to engage, participate. We've had some calling in. And if the congregation chooses to proceed to the next step, and we don't want to waste their time on hocus pocus if that's not the will of the congregation. But if it is, we would meet with them to share that vision, the ministry, and the goals, and listen to them. And some are going to be very supportive. Some are going to say, not in my backyard, I don't need the traffic. And so we'll work together to find a balance and to find something that is, a win-win for the community and the church. And as part of that is, if it were strictly all affordable housing, which there's a serious need, the problem is affordable housing doesn't automatically come with affordable transportation. So it may not be the fanciest car, but even in affordable housing, they often have more cars, and they each occupy a parking space, which then puts a challenge with how much parking you'd have to build to accommodate your congregation on Sundays and a Wednesday night choir practice and other events. Turns out assisted living, elder care, not as big a demand on cars. Daycare, usually it starts after rush hour, ends before. And medical office is usually a 9 to 5 operation with not a big demand on Sunday morning. So one of the key things at scale is that we can balance the cost of parking to fully serve the church with as much, if not more, parking than you have now. We just lower it 10 feet and probably put a second level, because there's always going to be some overlap, and then create the density in ostensibly 3, 4, 5 stories above grade to support maybe church programming right across the street. It creates a campus, maybe a campus that's compatible architecturally with the building, but maybe has a fresher, more youthful vibe for those that want a different style of worship or theater. It's not either or, it can be both. And to have flexible space for recreation, for youth in the community, for the arts, for other spaces that the church deems it needs to then be economically supported by daycare, medical office, assisted living, in the right combination that meets the needs. And that's partially the desire of the church, and it's partially the need in the marketplace. Because even without a capital campaign, this would not be an inexpensive building, because you'd want to do it right. Do it high quality, low maintenance, something that would last generations as a stewardship responsibility, both to the environment and financially, because that's really what you're responsible to do. And so we would balance that. So I'm not saying what percentage this or that. I'm saying the key needs fit into the zoning land use plan and have a great need and demand in the market that is supported by the financial resources. And your contribution would be the land that right now, as beautiful as that parking lot is, and I'm not judging, every drop of rain that hits picks up whatever contaminants are in and wind up in the Potomac River. And that's not really what we want to be doing to the world that God loves so much. You know, He gave His only Son. So the environmental component, by doing anything, would be 1,000% better than what's there now. And if there's any engineers, cylinders in the room, they could attest to that.
He's right.
But I think there's an environmental, a fiscal, and also a ministry stewardship opportunity, which makes this project so special. It's not a desperation, it's not a last ditch. It's an opportunity to elevate the ministry and relevance of this church, to do great things for this community. And I'd be happy to get as detailed and nerdy about area and plans and zoning as you'd like, but I'll wait for that to be in questions so I don't put people to sleep, because I get excited about this and it would put you all to sleep. You can-
Yep. Michael, thank you. One of the things, and I think Michael's been very good as we've been guiding through these initial discussions, is the thought of what is possible. And we've been very intentional in going through the variety of things, as Michael pointed out, the environmental, the fiscal, but we've all had that North Star about the ministry. What is God calling us actually to do with this land, this gift that's been given to us? So as we've been reaching out to the Mount Olivet community, we've been trying to reach into the various groups. We've had individual discussions. We've been outside in the fellowship hall and just outside of the way here to converse with people on a one-to-one basis. We also had a series of poster boards, because part of this is we didn't want to come up with an idea, but nothing that people can wrap their minds around, or at least understand what may be possible. So to those of you who have seen those poster boards, recognize it's just something to at least visualize, to see. But it's also about a possibility. In what's important to keep in mind is, as we continue to have these discussions, is we're going to walk through a process. And we're concluding the first part of this process, which is, call it for lack of a better word, the investigation. And we've reached a point where the investigation has come to an end, and we recognize we need to take more formal actions in order to continue the conversations. And so that's what's going to happen on May 21st with the church conference, if I'm using my language correctly, where we're going to have a motion, as Ryan mentioned, to say, do we want to continue this work? It's not a motion of, are we going to build a building and it's going to start in a year, or this is what the building's going to look like. It's going to be a more formalized process to look exactly at those variables that Michael pointed out and we've all pointed out, to put more flesh to the bones here. To also continue to get into with the Mount Olivet community. What is it that we're actually, what actually do we want to do with this ministry? We've laid out some ideas, some thoughts, some preliminary things that the market is looking for, but what do we want? It's also an opportunity to go more formally to the county government, to start engaging the county government as to what's possible. And Michael mentioned the zoning, but I'm sure there's a lot of other things they're going to be interested in. But we also have to make the community engagement to our neighbors around us, to get their feedback, to understand what their concerns are, to also articulate what we are thinking about. and to make sure that it's a constructive dialogue. So those are the sort of the next steps. One is May 21st, which is a stepping stone, and then the work continues on. Ultimately, if it continues to be a viable option, and there are options presented that are viable and to the benefit, we'll eventually come back to the Mount Olivet community and say, this is where we're at, this is what we'd like to do, can we do it, and get the permission of the Mount Olivet community to do that, after we've done all our preliminary work and more formal work. So I hope I've clarified a little bit about the next steps. But the purpose of these town halls is to get any questions that you may have. And we've gotten a wealth of well thought out questions and concerns and issues that are gonna continue to feed into this conversation. And we're grateful to those who have participated in those conversations, whether it's individually with Pastor Ed, or with me, or with Chuck Mitchell, or Ryan. We've heard a lot, and we're very grateful. But we're also looking to these town halls as a way to answer questions in a public forum, so that we have a lot of ears listening to the questions and answers. So you may have the same question someone else will have, and hopefully that will be answered. So what I'd like to do right now, and Ellen, if you would, if you just monitor, for those of you who are on the Zoom call, if you have a question, please put it in the chat, and we will be sure to answer the questions that are raised. Ellen's gonna give you a high sign, or we're gonna find out what those questions are. And we'd like you to use the chat feature in Zoom. For those of us who are in the room, hands raised, I'll call on you. To the extent, I'm gonna lean on Michael a lot actually, to answer questions. If it's something specific to Mount Olivet that is Mount Olivet oriented, I'll ask Pastor Ed to respond that's more Mount Olivet oriented. And if there's something legal, we may have Ryan talk a little bit about that as well. But we want to be able to answer questions, because again, the next decision point, if you will, is May 21st, and we want people to have as much information as possible to make an informed choice on our next steps. So with that, I'll stop, and I will start entertaining questions. Steve?
I apologize, I should probably know this, but this May 21st church conference, who's the deciders at that church conference? And then secondly, probably for Michael, on the building.
Well, why don't we go with first, then we'll get the second.
It's gonna be a church conference, so the entire congregation will be invited and will be allowed to be a part of the decision-making. We hope to arrive at consensus rather than voting, which is how we typically make decisions in
All
our,
right, so it's this congregation, it's not
it's just
UNC.
just Mount
Okay.
Olivet.
Yeah, no, is that what he's running?
8:30 on May 21st, a.m. And you had a question for Michael?
Well, yeah, and then if I understood correctly, you seem to think that we can, avoiding the capital campaign, leverage the value of the property itself to secure loans, I assume building loans or whatever, to do this and then pay those back with the proceeds from the medical office and whatever else winds up being the case.
I do believe that's possible. And the conversation, just to fully answer your question, is it certainly possible with the demand and need in the community to have everything from assisted living, daycare, medical office. But as the conversation will go, well, maybe it should be all affordable assisted living. Then what does affordable mean? Does that mean it's at the 80% average area median income, or is it the 50%? So at a certain point, if you are the most generous, where everything is amazing and free, costs somebody something. And so my hunch is, after listening, planning, testing the marketplace, reconciling with the county and community, we start off with some split, some percentage of market affordable mix, and dial those rheostats so it's in balance. And if somebody says, I think we should have 10% more affordability, that might be a capital campaign. But I think the key is the capital campaign, not that it's up to me, because it's up to you, maybe shouldn't be about bricks and mortar. But if somebody chose to increase the affordability or the generosity, and that came through the sacrificial act of tithing, that's a healthy thing to do spiritually and financially. But I don't see right now the need for it to be a highly subsidized, unless it is incredibly discounted, because the revenue and the expense equation is not unreasonable.
Stay close, Michael. All right, Stephen, do we ask?
I'm good.
Okay. Dottie?
I appreciate all the work that's gone into this thus far, and the process before we get to the groundbreaking. Has the committee discussed what amount we're going to be spending for the planning, the architectural drawings, after you get, all this feedback from the county board and the various community members? There'll be some upfront cost that I believe would be part of what the church would be paying. Is that a correct assumption?
So the question for the Zoom community is, and Dottie, you correct me, is about what are the upfront costs? Should the 21st there be a motion to go forward? What would be some of the upfront costs that have to be assumed by the church in terms of that continued planning effort? I'm going to let Michael speak to some of the general aspects of what a planning effort might be, and then I'll speak to the budgeting of it as in terms of the amount out of it.
Thanks.
It's a great question, and it's important because the process can be expensive. And since I do work with many nonprofits and many for-profit developers, I'll take one page out of the for-profit developer book, and that is no dime before it's time, because nobody likes to spend money until they know what the return on that investment is. So with that, we've been very cautious and kept things high level, simple, and conceptual without getting into a lot of engineering detail. And I think it's fairly safe to say, if you put this on the market tomorrow with a high level concept, you would have suitors by the end of the week, and tomorrow's by the end of the week, and I'm well aware of that. That's how fast.
Excuse me, I don't think you answered her question. Can you put a dollar amount on how much you're gonna spend for doing the planning?
The answer to that question is, it depends. And I was answering her question in that if you put it on the market early, it'd be very minimal, as in very, very little. The problem with that is the developer becomes in control earlier. So strategically, what we found is to balance, and I don't know the answer, the range could be, anywhere from a few thousand to over 100,000. So there's not an answer. I am not avoiding the question, but the answer becomes, what is the strategy and the need? Because if you go to market too early, the developer already knows the answer, and they're going to have an advantage, because a developer would be delighted to pay all the freight. But when you make a deal with the developer runs the show. So that's the balance of it. And I think Justin will talk more about the budget parameters overall, but the answer remains, it depends. And I was trying to share why and the sensitivity of what it depends on, so that you can make informed decisions.
And
Yes.
I apologize, I came in a little bit late. This may be something you've covered already, but is the intent to relinquish ownership of the property in exchange for these services, or does Mount Olivet still own the property?
That's also a great question, and that should have been covered earlier. All those options are on the table for you to decide. The predominant thinking is to consider a long-term ground lease that you can use a net present value so that the church retains ownership of the land forever, and the lease would be within the life cycle of the building. That could be anywhere from 40, 50, 75, or 100 years. And that's, again, it depends on what the mix of the market is in the life cycle of the project. So even on a ground lease, they would pay all the cost up front, including yours. But the more you give them control early, the less control you have on the outcome of how you use the land, and maybe the less competitive it is in the marketplace. The point is, if you do the work to really understand the final cost, headwinds and resistance of the county and community, so that what you're taking to market is something that is clearly organized, risk mitigated, and people understand it, then the prices will go up, up, up. If you go early and nobody knows, any developer is going to hedge their bet for the worst case scenario. And I think, personally, I think you bring a lot of goodwill as a church and the ministry objectives that you can reconcile those more cost effectively than take it to a broader marketplace to yield a higher price.
Can I give some context on that, Justin?
Oh, certainly, certainly. And I did want to come back to Dottie's question eventually about understanding the operating aspect of this in the budget process and on all of that.
So just to give a little more background on this from the committee perspective, even before we engaged with Michael, we were looking at options. One option would be just to sell the land. We'd have no place to park, but we could sell the entire thing and the church could invest the money. And the opposite extreme is that the church would borrow $100 million and build a building over there, and we could, control the whole building and do whatever we want with it. And neither of those extremes really makes sense. So that's where the ground lease is a really nice feature, where the church can effectively lease the land, have a lot of input into what gets built on the land, and then from the value of the land you're putting in, you get a revenue stream back onto the lease that you can use to pay for the church's piece of the new building. And so then again, if you want to do a capital campaign, you can have more subsidy for affordable housing or more church use in the building, but you don't have to do a capital campaign. You can use the value of the land to put that into it. So we looked at all those options, but the kind of the middle of the road made the most sense. And then at the end of the lease life cycle, whether that's 50 years or 100 years, the entire land parcel would come back to the Mile Olivet congregation that's then in existence, and my great-grandkids could figure out what to do with it next, with Michael's great-grandkids probably building the next building. So, but that's what we figured is kind of the most palatable to the congregation, and allowing us to have some control. And then to Michael's point, the more that we run with this as a congregation before you turn it over to the developers, the more we can shape what actually happens there. And that's why it's worth some additional investment by the congregation to get the outcome that matches our values and so forth. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Ryan. The last point I wanted to raise, which I think is towards Dottie's point and towards the gentleman's point, is ultimately how much is some of this going to cost? Even before we put a shovel into the ground, right? Is how much is it going to cost? And we know what we know, and we know what we don't know. And we don't know how much that will be. Because part of this is we're turning on the lights a little bit more to go down that path. We do know that there's going to be a cost. We do know that it's going to be within the operating budget. For those of you who may not be aware, and I'm going to spend like 3 sentences, the Mount Olivet budget, operating budget, runs on a July 1st to June 30th. So right now we're planning for next year's budget, operating budget. During that time, we go out to the ministry teams and we ask, how much are things going the cost, whether it's the worship ministry team, staff parish relations, we work with the trustees. We all get the various committees within the congregation to ask how much we think things are gonna occur. We're going to assume another expense, which is this planning effort. We don't know how much it is because we have to get permission first to do it. But there will be an expense, and we're going to have to figure that out and how much it is. But one of the things to talk about is, depending on the cost, as Michael said, it's that balancing of how much planning goes in to the ultimate yield you want. And the less planning or the absence of planning means you're putting your trust into that developer. And in that case, you're losing the control. So we're balancing, if you will, control to upfront costs. So I don't know the operating part of it, but it has to be folded in, it will be folded in, it's part of the budget operating discussions. The other part of this thinking is as if we get a good, if this process continues, and if there is a good deal to be had out there, that brings a yield back into the operating budget. In addition to all the deals that would go down in terms of managing the capital aspects of this, and the building and all of that, there is a revenue stream that is associated with this, which is the lease payment. For lack of a better phrase, it's the lease payment. And, one of the ways to think about structuring that is let's say we do come up with a lease. And let's say this is the approach we're gonna take. Do we want more money up front? Think of it like, I'll take half of the money up front and slow payments down the road. Do we want to even out the payments? Think of rent. Every month I'm gonna get the same amount of money. That's sort of the thinking that goes into it. Now, using that revenue stream also has its implications, right? Our capital needs, our operating needs, which may or may not increase as a result based on how this all plays itself out. So I don't want to get too far or too long-winded, but I want to answer Dottie's point, which is very specifically, we don't know how much some of these upfront costs are going to be, because we don't know how much the planning we're going to have to do. We know there's planning to be done.
Right.
We do know that. We have a Sherpa with us who is certainly going to work with us and say, okay, here's going down the line, some of the, more specifically, should the congregation on the 21st proceed forward, here are some of the things to consider, and here's what you can expect in terms of costs. That has to get folded into the operating budget. Did that get towards the answer of your question, Dottie and John, sir?
So, actually, I thought I heard some estimates in there that it would cost somewhere between nominal a few thousand to 100,000 or 200,000, somewhere in that range.
Yep.
Is that, those are reasonable numbers for upper and lower bounds?
Yes,
Okay, thank you.
yes.
We're not gonna be doing every single architectural plan down to where the pipes go. The developer will hire an architect to pay for that, so we need to get this far enough along that we've shaped what's gonna come out of it, right?
So for the Zoom audience, basically Ryan's point was, there are a lot of things that we have to do as the Mount Olivet congregation in the planning of this. But at a certain point in time, there's more specific things like architectural details are done through an architect that would be working with the developer. So that's sort of the consideration back and forth of costs. Dottie?
Right, just to clarify, and I very much appreciate what Michael had said at the outset, was that we wanted to do it right in terms of being good neighbors, and that's no easy feat to do. But I was just really more curious in order, just sort of the ballpark order of magnitude. We've got the example of the Presbyterian Church down on Columbia Pike that's done this recently. We've got Clarendon, Central United Methodist Church, and my presumption is that they also have worked with their community and have done it right. So I was just looking sort of for order of magnitude, time spent with people going to meet with the county.
Right. Oh, pardon me, Michael. So for the question for the Zoom, I'm mindful of the Zoom audience from Dottie is learning from the other congregations that have gone forward on this, and you mentioned the Presbyterian Church on Columbia Pike,
Right.
as well as Central United Methodist, which is in Ballston area. What's the experiences they've had in terms of these upfront costs and some of the issues that they've addressed? So Michael, I'll let you speak to that.
And I do want to be specific about answering the question, but there's really not a specific answer because the variables will determine when you commit and if you commit. Because as you go down the road, we'll all be looking to not spend any money until you're confident about taking the next step. Because you don't want to go way down the road and spend even $20,000 and find out you shouldn't have gone that far. But if you do go that far and it looks promising for a accretive yield, both in ministry and in dollars, then you take the next step. At a certain point, I don't think the church is going to wind up taking ownership of the project and completing the architectural drawings. But I do think to sell an asset sight unseen on the results might be considered foolish because you wouldn't know. So on a rough order of magnitude, if you could get it through 15 or 20% design, so you understand what you're getting and you understand what's expected from the developer, so you don't wind up having an awkward conversation with lawyers in a year and a half of, well, that's what I thought you meant. And that's a very expensive and uncomfortable conversation. And I'd prefer to just to avoid that. You know, I tend to be good-natured and optimistic and see the best in everybody, but I don't like asking a question to the government or a developer until I already know the answer. I just like knowing the answer before I ask the question, and that's what we'd like to do.
Thank you, Michael. We have a question from the Zoom audience. So Ellen's gonna state it, then I'm gonna repeat it.
Do we know the tax implications of working with a for-profit developer and leasing the land?
Do we know the tax implications of working with a for-profit developer on the leasing of the land?
I'm not an accountant or a tax attorney, but having done this many times, the church space and church operation would remain tax exempt. Any outside revenue that was not donated, that was a fee for service, for medical office, for assisted living, would be a taxable income. And the real estate that would support it would be subject to real estate taxes, which then again would be part of the developer's, triple net lease. So they'd be responsible for rent payments on a long-term lease and their own taxes, insurance, maintenance, and the like. So for the church and church spaces, there's no net effect. For any spaces that generate third-party revenue, it's a business and you'd be paying taxes on it.
Thank you, Michael. Other questions? I'll actually raise then a couple points that were raised to me, and again, some of this is going to be not quite sure yet, but I think they're important points. One of it, for instance, is I was asked, well, what if we know that if we go forward with this and a structure is built, a portion of it is going to be available to Mount Olivet, and as Michael just pointed out, on a tax, but it's space that's there. That may necessarily mean that we may need more staff within Mount Olivet to manage the space or manage the programming in it, or for whatever purposes it may have. And the answer is yes, that is a possibility and a probability, but that's something that has to yet be determined, because we would have to decide first what the space would be used for, what type of programming, what type of arts, what type of other aspects. And so that would have to be considered, but it would be an important consideration going down the road. The other question that's raised, and I think it's for a point of clarification, is if you think about it, ultimately there has to be an engagement of a group within Mount Olivet with either the developer or with whoever is managing the property, and what will that look like? What will the Mount Olivet aspect of that look like? Or how will we, as Mount Olivet, be a partner in that engagement? And that is yet another factor to be discovered and to be determined. Is part of this is ultimately in working with the developer, what roles and responsibilities they will have. Part of it is enforcing those roles and responsibility, and having a governing body, or for lack of a better word, a governing body here in Mount Olivet to oversee that. And that's a discussion that will also have to be developed in determining what's the best organization or engagement that we will have with the group and body that we would have. Because it's not only the short term through the project itself, but it's also the ongoing engagement once a property would be in place and what that would mean. Because ultimately, let's take a very awful worst case scenario that what if the developer's running into trouble? What if the management company's running into trouble? What happens then? But we would hopefully have, and we'll be very thoughtfully, this is how we would engage, this is how we would be, these would be our rights and responsibilities, and we have a group of folks minding and making sure those things are being carried out. So those are two, to me, very important aspects that I wanted to raise as well.
If I could just elaborate.
Right? And Ryan's gonna elaborate a little further on that.
Thanks, Justin. So with if you go the ground lease approach, then there'll be some covenants or what we call flow down provisions where the Mount Olivet sets kind of the ground rules. This is what you can do in the building, these are the kind of tenants we want to have, these are the kind of tenants we don't want to have. And then those would become an obligation of the developer and of the subsequent tenants inside the building. And any lease or sublease, and kind of go down the chain, would have those same obligations. So that's part of what we're going to be very careful about is structuring those rules and covenants as a part of this initial phase, so that when we hand it off to the point where the Mount Olivet's not the only party in control of this, we have a developer partner, that we can enforce those high-level obligations. But then there will be some body of the church, perhaps trustees or some subset of trustees, that would have this oversight as to administering the lease. And that might not be very cumbersome. It might be a once-a-year meeting to look at everything, but that's some of the oversight you have.
Thank you, Ryan. Any other questions, concerns from the Zoom community? If you have any, please enter into the chat. We're monitoring it. Does anyone in the audience have any questions, comments, concerns? Going once, twice. What I'm going to do then is conclude with a couple points. First is, again, to revisit next steps. The next critical point in this process is May 21st, church conference. The whole Mount Olivet community will be invited to attend the church conference. There will be a motion on the table that would ask the congregation to move forward with these continuing planning efforts. It is not a motion to approve a building or in any way, shape, or form to build. It is just to continue the planning process forward. So after May 21st, if that motion passed, the work will continue. The other thing is there's been a lot of great points raised tonight and in our conversations. Those conversations will continue. We're going to continue to have the poster boards up for the next couple of weeks, both down outside of the way as well as upstairs. And between Chuck and myself, we're going to be manning the booths. If there are any small groups that want to meet with us, please indicate through the church staff or directly with Chuck Mitchell or myself to say, hey, can you stop by and drop by our class or our meeting, and we'll be happy to join you and answer any questions or concerns. We want this to be a continued an outreach to the Mount Olivet community to give as much information as possible so that you're fully informed on May 21st with the motion that would come forward. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Michael for any closing comments, and then after Michael, Ed, if you want to close the meeting down, we'll go from there. Michael, if you have any concluding comments.
But thank you all, and I just think it's an important time to get together to answer questions or to hear other people's questions. I would just like to ask you to pray for this process, for your leadership here, and that something really special be done with the site, because it's a great opportunity to do something very special, and we'll be here with you as needed. Thank you.
Thank you all. We have preschool in here tomorrow. It's calling for rain, so there are going to be tricycles running around. There are 2 carts back here. If some of you will be willing to help put chairs away, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Tier. Tier will take care of it. Nobody needs to stick around. He's got it all under control. Let's pray together. Lord, give us courage. Give us a sense of vision of what can be, and give us the courage to take those steps, trusting that you go with us. In fact, you're the one that called us to consider this in the first place. All for your kingdom, all for your glory, all because of your mercy and grace. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
And I'm smiling.
The